The worn wooden handle of the knife felt like an extension of her own hand. It was her father's knife, the steel blade darkened with age and honed to a razor's edge from decades of faithful service. Elena Rossi moved with a practiced, fluid rhythm, the blade a silver blur against the green of the fresh basil. The sharp, clean scent filled her small corner of the kitchen, a single note in the symphony of the dinner rush. Garlic sizzled in olive oil on the stove, a deep, nutty aroma that promised richness. A massive pot of her Nona's secret tomato sauce bubbled slowly, its sweet and tangy perfume blanketing the entire restaurant. This was the smell of home. It was the cell of her entire life. Rossi's trattoria was a loud, warm, beautiful chaos on a Friday night. The clatter of plates from the wash station, the hiss of pasta hitting boiling water, the shouts of orders called across the pass. It was a language Elena understood better than anything. Through the small rectangular window into the dining room, she could see a mosaic of life, families celebrating birthdays, couples leaning close over checkered tablecloths, old friends laughing with mouths full of bread. The light in the dining room was golden and low, catching the wine in people's glasses and illuminating the faded photographs that lined the walls. Photos of her grandparents on their wedding day, of her father as a young boy with flour dusting his nose, of her and her brother Leo covered in spaghetti sauce as toddlers. Every picture told a story. Every corner of the restaurant held a memory. A waiter, a young man named Thomas with perpetually panicked eyes, rushed to the pass. Two carbonara, one lasagna for table 7, Ellie. They're in a hurry. Elena didn't look up from the gnocchi she was carefully plating. They're always in a hurry, Thomas. Tell them perfection takes a minute. The lasagna is ready. The carbonara is firing now. Go. He nodded, grabbing the steaming plate of lasagna and disappearing back into the warm chaos of the dining room. Elena felt a surge of pride. This was more than a treat. It was a legacy. Her father, Marco, had poured his soul into this place, just as his mother had before him. He taught Elena how to feel the dough, how to listen to the sauce, how to understand that cooking wasn't about following a recipe. It was about pouring love onto a plate. Now, with her father getting older, the weight of that legacy was settling more and more onto her shoulders. She welcomed it. She loved the heat, the pressure, the beautiful, exhausting work of feeding people. Her younger brother Leo appeared at her side, wiping down a tray. He worked the front of the house, his calm demeanor a perfect balance to her fiery kitchen presence. Dad called, Leo said, his voice a little tight. He said the new supplier delivered the wrong flour again. Elena sighed, sprinkling Parmesan over the gnocchi. Of course they did. Did you tell him I'll call them tomorrow and give them hell? You know, Dad, Leo shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. He wanted to go down there himself and sort it out. At 8 o'clock at night, he needs to slow down. She handed the plates of gnocchi to Leo. Table 4, and tell them not to rush. He smiled for real this time. I'll try. As Leo slipped back into the dining room, Elena allowed herself a brief moment of peace. The controlled frenzy of the kitchen was her sanctuary. The familiar weight of her father's knife in her hand was her anchor. She felt him in every corner of this room, in the worn floorboards and the scent of simmering tomatoes. His heart was the engine that powered this place. Her hands were just the ones keeping it running. She felt a deep, unwavering certainty that as long as she was here, in this kitchen, everything would be all right. The world outside could be complicated and cruel, but inside these walls, there was only family, food, and love. It was a simple, sacred promise. The shrill, piercing ring of the landline phone cut through the kitchen noise like a shard of glass. It was an unnatural sound, different from the rhythmic chaos of dinner service. Everyone in the kitchen paused for a fraction of a second. No one called the restaurant's kitchen line during a rush unless it was an emergency. Elena's heart gave a single, hard thump against her ribs. She wiped her hands on her apron, her eyes fixed on the flashing red light of the phone. One of the line cooks answered it, his expression immediately shifting from focus to concern. Ellie, he called out, holding the receiver. It's for you, it's Leo. A cold knot formed in Elena's stomach. Leo was just here. Why would he be calling the kitchen line? She took the phone, the plastic suddenly feeling slick and cold in her grasp. Leo, what is it? What's wrong?" His voice came through the line, thin and fractured with panic. "Ellie, Ellie, it's Dad." The world tilted. The loud, comforting sounds of the kitchen faded into a dull, distant roar. All she could hear was her own blood rushing in her ears. "Leo, slow down. I can't understand you. What about Dad?" "He, there was an accident," he stammered, his breath catching in a sob. "He went to talk to those construction guys, the ones from the big project down the street. Something happened, a wall, scaffolding. I don't know. They said something fell." Elena's knuckles went white as she gripped the phone cord. The construction site, the massive, ugly luxury apartment complex being built by Blackwood Enterprises. They'd been trying to buy out the entire block for the last year. Her father had been the last holdout. He'd refused every offer, every thinly veiled threat. He said this corner was not for sale. It was their home. "Where is he?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet, all the fire in it suddenly turning to ice. "The ambulance just took him. St. Michael's Hospital," Leo choked out. "Ellie, it looked bad. He wasn't moving." A plate crashed somewhere in the kitchen, but Elena didn't flinch. Her world had narrowed to the voice on the phone and the terrifying images flooding her mind. Her father, lying on the ground, still, the man who was the foundation of her entire world, the man whose hands were as strong and steady as ancient trees. "I'm on my way," she said, her voice a flat, hollow echo of itself. She hung up the phone without another word. For a moment she just stood there staring at the wall. The faces of her staff swam before her, a blur of worried expressions. The smell of garlic and tomatoes suddenly felt suffocating, wrong. The lifeblood of the restaurant now seemed like a cruel mockery. How could the sauce keep simmering when her father's own heart might be struggling? She ripped off her apron and threw it onto the counter. "Shut it down," she commanded, her voice raw. "Everything. Shut it down now. Tell the customers there's a family emergency. Refund their meals. I don't care. Just get everyone out." There were no questions, no arguments. They saw the look in her eyes. The kitchen staff moved with quiet, somber efficiency, the usual energy replaced by a heavy sense of dread. Elena walked through the dining room, a ghost in her own home. The happy chatter had died down, replaced by confused murmurs as the staff began explaining the situation. She didn't see the customers. She didn't see the half-eaten meals or the glasses of wine. She saw only the path to the door, the path that would take her to the hospital, to her father. She felt a desperate, primal urge to run, to push past everything and everyone until she was by his side. Within 15 minutes, the restaurant was empty. The silence that descended was heavier and more profound than any she had ever experienced within these walls. The warm golden lights now seemed to cast long, ominous shadows. The family photos on the wall felt like ghosts, their smiling faces a painful reminder of a world that had existed only moments ago, a world where her father was safe. Leo had said he'd meet her at the hospital. She grabbed her keys and her purse from the small office, her hands trembling so badly she could barely fit the key into the lock on the cash drawer. She took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to force the image of her father from her mind. It was no use. It was burned there, a horrifying premonition of brokenness and pain. She had to go. She had to be with him. She turned off the main lights, plunging the dining room into near darkness, lit only by the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the front windows. As she reached for the front door, a figure stepped out of the shadows just outside, blocking her path. Elena's heart leaped into her throat. It was a man, tall and impeccably dressed in a dark, expensive suit that seemed to absorb the dim light. He carried a sleek leather briefcase and wore an expression of calm, professional detachment. He did not belong here. He was a creature from another world, a world of cold glass and steel, not warm brick and worn wood. "Miss Elena Rossi?" he asked, his voice smooth and devoid of any emotion. It was the kind of voice that delivered bad news without flinching. "Who are you?" Elena snapped, her patience gone, her fear manifesting as sharp-edged anger. "The restaurant is closed. You need to leave." "My name is Arthur Vance," he said, holding up a hand as if to calm a wild animal. "I'm an attorney representing Mr. Damian Blackwood." The name hit her like a physical blow. Blackwood, the man behind the construction project. The man who wanted her family's home. The timing was too perfect, too cruel. It couldn't be a coincidence. "You have 5 seconds to get away from this door," Elena said, her voice low and shaking with a rage that was quickly eclipsing her fear. "I understand this is a difficult time," Vance said, his tone infuriatingly placid. "I won't take long. Mr. Blackwood has instructed me to present you with a final offer to purchase this property. He is prepared to be very generous, considering the circumstances." Elena stared at him, disbelief warring with a dawning, sickening horror. "Considering the circumstances? What circumstances are you talking about?" Vance opened his briefcase with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. He pulled out a thick portfolio bound in dark blue leather. "Mr. Blackwood is aware of your father's accident," he said, placing the portfolio on the small host stand near the door. The word accident was delivered with a slight, almost imperceptible emphasis. It was a message. He also knows that this business has been operating under significant financial strain for some time. Mounting debts, overdue payments to suppliers. It's a difficult position to be in. Elena felt the blood drain from her face. How could he know that? They had been struggling, it was true. Her father's pride had kept him from telling her the full extent of it, but she had seen the bills piling up. She had felt the quiet desperation behind his insistence that they didn't need to sell. "Our offer," Vance continued, tapping a perfectly manicured finger on the portfolio, "would alleviate all of that. It would pay off every outstanding debt associated with this establishment and your family. It would cover any unexpected medical expenses you may now be facing. It would leave you with a substantial sum to start over. Somewhere else." Elena's mind was reeling. Medical expenses. He had said medical expenses. This wasn't an offer. It was a threat wrapped in a thin veneer of civility. They had done this. They had hurt her father to force her hand. The cold knot in her stomach tightened into a ball of pure, incandescent fury. "My father is in the hospital because of you," she whispered, the words barely audible. Vance's expression didn't flicker. "Your father was trespassing on a private construction site late at night. It was an unfortunate and frankly avoidable incident. Mr. Blackwood's company has a team of very capable lawyers who are prepared to argue that the liability rests entirely with him. It would be a messy, prolonged, and very expensive legal battle, a battle you cannot afford to fight and certainly cannot win." He let the words hang in the air, each one a poisoned dart. He was laying it all out for her. The trap. They would injure her father and then use the law to blame him for it. They would bury her family in legal fees and debt until she had no choice but to surrender the one thing her father loved most, just to save him. It was monstrous. It was the work of a man with no soul. For a long moment, Elena said nothing. She looked past the lawyer, through the glass of the front door, to the street outside. She saw the reflection of her own face, pale and taut. She saw the reflection of the empty tables in the dark, silent room behind her. Her father's entire life was in this room. His dreams, his sweat, his joy, his history. And a man named Damian Blackwood thought he could break her father's body and then buy his soul for a pile of money. A strange calm washed over her. The trembling in her hands stopped. The panic in her chest subsided, replaced by a cold, hard resolve that felt as solid and unyielding as granite. The fear was still there, a deep, icy current beneath the surface. But the rage was now a shield. It was armor. She reached out and took the heavy portfolio from the stand. She didn't open it. She didn't need to see the insulting number inside. Its purpose was not financial. It was psychological. It was a symbol of their power and her family's vulnerability. She held the lawyer's gaze, her green eyes burning with a fire he seemed unprepared for. He took a small, almost involuntary step back. Slowly, deliberately, Elena closed her hand around the portfolio. Her knuckles were white. The expensive leather creaked in protest. She tightened her grip, her fingers digging in, her entire body trembling with the force of her suppressed fury. With a sudden violent twist, she began to crush it. The thick cardstock and papers inside buckled and tore. She squeezed and squeezed, the sound of crinkling paper and snapping plastic binding loud in the oppressive silence. She didn't stop until the pristine, professional document was a mangled, pathetic ball in her fist. She held it up for him to see, a declaration of war. "Here is my counteroffer," she said, her voice low, steady, and vibrating with an intensity that made the air crackle. She let the crumpled mess fall to the floor between them. "You go back to your boss," she said, taking a step toward him, forcing him to retreat another step out onto the pavement. "You tell Mr. Blackwood that he didn't just break a wall tonight. He has no idea what he has started." She looked past him, up at the distant, glittering skyscrapers that clawed at the night sky. One of them was his, the Blackwood Tower. He was up there somewhere, in his sterile, perfect world, thinking he had already won. Her gaze snapped back to the lawyer. A cold, determined light shone in her eyes. The hospital could wait just a little longer. First, she needed to face the monster himself. "And you can tell him," she finished, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "that I'm going to see him myself." The worn, crumpled paper felt like a burning coal in Elena's fist. Outside the taxi window, the city lights smeared into long, frantic streaks of gold and red, a frantic heartbeat against the damp glass. Each bump in the road was a jolt, a physical reminder of the chaos that had torn through her life in a single afternoon. Her brother Leo's panicked voice still echoed in her ears, a frantic counterpoint to the sterile, calm tones of the lawyer. But it was the image of her father, Marco, lying in a hospital bed that fueled the fire in her chest. His strong hands, the ones that could shape pasta dough with such gentle precision, were now bruised and still. The taxi pulled up to a tower of black glass and steel that clawed at the night sky. Blackwood Tower. The name itself felt like a threat, cold and unyielding. Elena paid the driver without looking at him, her entire focus on the building before her. It didn't have a soul. It was a monument to power, a place where men like Damian Blackwood decided the fates of people like her father. She took a deep breath, the city air thick with exhaust fumes and a promise of rain. The crumpled paper in her pocket felt heavier now, a testament to everything she was about to lose. She pushed the thought away. This was not about losing. This was about fighting back. She walked through the massive revolving doors into a silence that was more intimidating than any noise. The lobby was a cavern of polished marble and cold, recessed lighting. It smelled of nothing, an antiseptic emptiness that was the complete opposite of her family's trattoria, which always smelled of garlic, yeast, and simmering tomatoes. A woman sat behind a desk that looked like a block of carved ice, her expression as smooth and hard as the surface she guarded. Elena's worn boots squeaked faintly on the floor, the only sound in the vast space. She felt small, out of place, a splash of messy, emotional color in a black and white world. Elena marched straight to the desk. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. "I'm here to see Damian Blackwood." Her voice came out stronger than she expected, sharp and clear in the oppressive quiet. The receptionist looked up, her gaze flicking over Elena's faded jeans and simple jacket with faint, practiced disdain. "Do you have an appointment, miss?" "No," Elena said, her hands clenching at her sides. "It's personal." A small, dismissive smile touched the woman's lips. "Mr. Blackwood doesn't take personal, unscheduled meetings. If you'd like to leave a message—" "I'm not leaving a message." Elena leaned forward, her palms flat on the cold desk. "You're going to call him, and you're going to tell him that Elena Rossi is here. You're going to tell him it's about her father, Marco." The receptionist's composure didn't waver. "I'm afraid that's not possible." Rage, pure and hot, surged through Elena. This was a part of it. The walls of money and procedure designed to keep people like her out, to make them feel powerless. Over the woman's shoulder, she saw a bank of sleek, bronze elevators. A quiet chime announced one was arriving. Without a second thought, she pushed off the desk and ran. "Ma'am, security!" the receptionist called out, her voice finally losing its icy calm. Elena didn't look back. She could hear the heavy footsteps of guards approaching from the side. She was fast, fueled by a desperation they couldn't possibly understand. She dodged a large man in a dark suit, his hand grasping at empty air. The elevator doors were closing. She threw herself forward, shoving her arm into the gap. The doors jolted, met the resistance of her body, and slid back open with a reluctant groan. She scrambled inside, jabbing the button for the penthouse floor, the highest one. A guard's face appeared in the gap, his expression furious, but the doors were already closing, sealing her inside the small, mirrored box. The elevator ascended with unnerving speed and silence. Her own reflection stared back at her, a wild-eyed woman with fiery hair escaping her bun and two bright spots of color on her cheeks. Her breathing was ragged, her knuckles white where she gripped the handrail. A small, terrified part of her brain was screaming, asking what she thought she was doing. But a louder voice, the one that held the memory of her grandmother's stubborn pride, drowned it out. This man had tried to break her family. He was not going to do it from the safety of his ivory tower. He was going to look her in the eye. When the doors opened, they did so directly into a private foyer. The space was as minimalist and cold as the lobby below. A young man at a sleek, dark desk looked up, his eyes widening in alarm as she stormed past him. "Excuse me, you can't go in there," he called out, already rising from his chair. Elena ignored him. She saw only one destination, a pair of imposing double doors made of a wood so dark it was almost black. She didn't hesitate. She shoved them open and stepped inside. The office was breathtakingly large. An entire wall was a single pane of glass offering a panoramic, godlike view of the city sprawled below. The lights of thousands of cars, thousands of homes looked like scattered jewels. It was the view of a man who believed he owned everything he could see. The furniture was sparse and severe, all sharp lines and dark leather. It was a room built for intimidation, not comfort. And there he was. Damian Blackwood stood with his back to her, looking out at the city. He was holding a heavy crystal glass, the amber liquid inside catching the light. He was tall, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit that seemed molded to his frame. He didn't jump or startle at her sudden entrance. He simply turned, slowly, as if he had been expecting her all along. His face was all sharp angles and severe beauty. Dark hair, a strong jaw, and eyes the color of a winter storm. They were cold, calculating, and utterly devoid of emotion. He looked at her, taking in her disheveled appearance, and a flicker of something that might have been amusement crossed his features before it vanished. "Miss Rossi," he said. His voice was calm, clipped, and low. It held a quiet power that was far more chilling than a shout. "I was wondering when you would make your way up." The sheer arrogance of it stole her breath for a second. "You knew I would come?" "I know that people in your position tend to be driven by emotion," he said, taking a slow, deliberate sip from his glass. "It's a predictable, if inconvenient, variable." The fire in her chest blazed hotter. "Emotion? You put my father in a hospital bed and you call my reaction emotion?" Her voice trembled, thick with unshed tears and fury. "That construction beam didn't fall by accident. Your smirking lawyer made that very clear. You did this." He didn't deny it. He didn't have to. He simply walked with a predator's grace into the massive desk that sat like an altar in the center of the room. He placed his glass down, the clink of crystal on wood echoing in the silence. "Your father's establishment occupies a piece of land that I require." He was made a generous offer. Multiple generous offers, in fact. He chose to be difficult. "Difficult?" Elena's laugh was a sharp, broken sound. "He chose to protect his life's work. He chose to protect his father's legacy. Our home, something you wouldn't know anything about." She took a step closer, her hands shaking. "That restaurant has been in my family for 60 years. My nonna brought those recipes over from the old country. My father has worked in that kitchen since he was 15 years old. It's all he has. It's all we have." Damian sat down in his large leather chair, the picture of untouchable calm. He steepled his fingers, his cold gray eyes fixed on her. "Sentiment is a poor foundation for a business, Miss Rossi. Your father was running a failing restaurant on a piece of prime real estate. His refusal to sell was not noble. It was foolish. I was merely introducing a more compelling argument for him to reconsider his position." The clinical, detached way he spoke about her father's life, about the violence he had inflicted, made her feel sick. It was as if he were discussing a negotiation tactic in a boardroom, not the deliberate harming of another human being. Tears finally welled in her eyes, hot and stinging. She refused to let them fall. A compelling argument. He has 3 broken ribs, a concussion. The doctors don't know if there's permanent damage. He's lying in a hospital bed, in pain and terrified. Because you wanted his land? The situation is unfortunate, Damien conceded, though his tone held no trace of sympathy. It was the kind of thing one might say about a dip in the stock market. But it is also temporary. Your father will recover. The offer on the table, however, is final. I would advise you to take it. Never, she spat the word. We will never sell to you. He leaned back in his chair, a faint sigh escaping his lips, the kind of sigh one makes when dealing with a stubborn child. Your family is in considerable debt. The hospital bills will only add to that. I am aware of the 2 mortgages on the property, the loans taken against your suppliers. Without the restaurant operating, you have no income. Within weeks, you will be in default. I, on the other hand, have a team of lawyers who have already found several zoning violations and health code infractions that could have your business shut down permanently, even if you were to reopen. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. If you refuse my offer, you will not only lose the restaurant, you will lose it for nothing. You will be left with nothing but debt. This is not a threat, Miss Rossi. It is a statement of fact. It is the way the world works. She stared at him, her entire body trembling. He had investigated every corner of their lives. He knew every weakness, every vulnerability. He had laid a perfect trap, and her father had been the bait. The sheer calculated cruelty of it was monstrous. He wasn't just a businessman. He was a vulture, circling, waiting for them to finally bleed out. You're a monster, she whispered, the words raw with grief and hatred. Damien's expression did not change. I am a man who gets what he wants, and I want that property. He gestured vaguely toward the generous offer letter she knew was still crumpled in her pocket. Take the deal. Pay your father's medical bills. Start over somewhere else. It is the most logical, sensible path forward. Let go of the emotion and think clearly for once. That was it. That was the final push. His condescending advice, his complete dismissal of her family's pain as mere emotion. He spoke of her father's legacy as if it were a faulty piece of equipment to be discarded. He sat there in his $1 million suit in his $1 billion office, telling her to be sensible while her father lay broken because of his greed. A wave of white-hot rage washed over her, so powerful it silenced every other thought in her head. The world narrowed to his impassive, arrogant face. On the corner of his desk sat a crystal pitcher of iced water in a single empty glass waiting to be filled. Her eyes darted from the pitcher to his face. She wouldn't be sensible. She wouldn't be logical. She would give him the only thing she had left, her defiance. In one swift, unplanned movement, she lunged forward. She didn't grab the pitcher. She snatched the heavy glass he had been drinking from, the one he had just set down. There was still a small amount of amber liquid in the bottom. She ignored it, plunging the glass into the pitcher of water. Ice cubes clinked, and cold water sloshed over her hand, the shock of it barely registering. His eyes widened just for a fraction of a second. It was the first genuine surprise she had seen on his face. You want to talk about variables? She hissed, her voice low and shaking with the force of her anger. Here's one you didn't predict. And with a guttural cry that was torn from the very depths of her soul, she threw the contents of the glass directly into his face. The world seemed to slow down. The water arced through the air, a spray of icy droplets catching the light from the window. It hit him with a sharp splash. For a heartbeat, there was only stunned silence. The water dripped from his dark hair, ran in rivulets down his sharp cheekbones and over the collar of his pristine white shirt. He didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He just sat there, soaked, staring at her. The mask of calm indifference had finally cracked, but what lay beneath was not anger. It was something far colder, far more dangerous. It was the quiet, absolute stillness of the predator that has been challenged. The office doors burst open. The 2 security guards she had evaded in the lobby rushed in, their faces grim. They grabbed her arms in a hard, professional grip, their strength overwhelming. She struggled for a moment, a useless, reflexive act of defiance, before her body went limp with the sudden, crushing weight of what she had just done. They began to drag her backward, her boots scraping against the expensive rug. Her eyes were locked with Damien's. As they pulled her out of the room, he made no move to stop them. He simply reached into his suit jacket, produced a folded white handkerchief, and began to slowly, methodically, pat the water from his face. His cold, gray eyes never left hers, not until the heavy doors swung shut, cutting him from her view. The final look he gave her was not one of fury. It was a silent, chilling promise of consequences yet to come. The bitter chill of the city street did little to cool the fire in Elena's veins. Security had deposited her on the pavement with practiced indifference. The glass doors of Blackwood Tower slid shut, reflecting a distorted image of her, wild-eyed and flushed with useless rage. The water she had thrown felt like a child's tantrum against a mountain. It had done nothing. He had barely flinched. Now the adrenaline was fading, replaced by a hollow, trembling cold. Her hands felt clumsy and foreign. Her mind replayed his face, the cool disinterest in his gray eyes. It was the look of a man swatting a fly. She walked for what felt like hours, the city noise a dull roar in her ears. Each step was heavy, dragging her toward the one place she needed to be, the one place she dreaded most. St. Michael's Hospital smelled of antiseptic and quiet fear. The soft, rhythmic beeping of machines was the building's steady, anxious heartbeat. She found her brother Leo in the waiting area, his face pale and his shoulders slumped. He looked up as she approached, his eyes asking the question he was too afraid to speak. She just shook her head, and a fresh wave of despair washed over him. Their father's room was dim. Marco Rossi was a shadow of the vibrant man who commanded a kitchen with laughter and authority. He lay small against the white sheets, his face etched with pain and exhaustion. An IV line snaked into his arm, a fragile tether to this sterile, unwelcome world. His eyes, usually so full of life, were clouded and weary. He tried to smile when he saw her, but it was a pained grimace. Elena moved to his bedside, her throat tight. She took his hand, his skin papery and cool. His knuckles, usually dusted with flour, were bruised. "Hey, Papa," she whispered, forcing a warmth she did not feel into her voice. He squeezed her hand weakly. "Ellie," he rasped. His voice was thin, fragile. "You shouldn't be here. You should be at the restaurant. It's Friday night." Tears pricked her eyes. She blinked them back fiercely. "The restaurant can wait. Leo is handling things. How are you feeling?" The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. Leo was a wreck, and the restaurant was dark and empty. Marco's gaze drifted past her, toward the window and the city lights beyond. "Tired," he admitted. "My head, it hurts to think." He turned his eyes back to her, and she saw a deep paternal fear that had nothing to do with his own pain. "Leo told me about the lawyers, about Blackwood." He paused, taking a shallow breath. "Elena, listen to me. This man, he is not like us. This is not a dispute over a bad batch of olive oil." "I know, Papa. I'm handling it." "No," he insisted, a flicker of his old strength returning. "You don't. Let it go." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. "What? Let it go. This is your life. This is Nona's legacy." "You are my legacy," he said, his voice cracking. "You and Leo. The restaurant, it is just bricks. It is just a building full of ghosts and memories. Good memories, yes, but not worth your safety." He tried to sit up, hissing in pain as he clutched his bandaged ribs. "Promise me, Elena. Promise me you will not fight him. There is no winning." She couldn't speak. Her own father, the man whose honor she was fighting for, was telling her to surrender. She looked at his broken form, at the monitors charting his fragile hold on the present, and she knew this was Damien Blackwood's work. It wasn't just business. It was a physical assault on her entire world. She smoothed the blanket over him, her touch gentle. "Just rest, Papa. Please. We'll talk about it when you're stronger." She could not make a promise she had no intention of keeping. The next morning, Elena sat in the stuffy office of Arthur Davies, their family's lawyer for over 20 years. The room was cramped, filled with towers of files that smelled of dust and time. Arthur was a kind man with a perpetually worried expression, A man used to handling wills and property deeds, not corporate warfare. He pushed a stack of papers across his cluttered desk, his face grim. "It's bad, Elena," he began, his voice low. "Worse than I thought." Elena stared at the documents, a sea of dense legal text she couldn't comprehend. "What does it say?" "It says Damien Blackwood is very, very good at what he does," Arthur sighed, removing his glasses and rubbing his eyes. "He didn't just make an offer. He prepared for a siege. A few months ago, a shell corporation he controls bought the commercial loan your father took out 6 years ago, the one for the kitchen renovations." Elena's stomach tightened. "We've never missed a payment." "It doesn't matter. There are covenants in these complex loans. Clauses about maintaining a certain level of liquid assets, about property valuation. His accountants are claiming you've been in technical default for the last 18 months. It's nonsense, but it's legal nonsense. It's enough to trigger an acceleration of the debt. They're demanding the full balance be paid immediately." "The full balance? We don't have that kind of money. We barely make payroll some months." "He knows that," Arthur said softly. "That's the point. And there's more." He tapped another page. "They've filed a complaint with the city planning department. They claim the patio your grandfather built in 1979 violates a zoning ordinance that was passed in 1985. They're demanding it be torn down or that we pay exorbitant fines for every day it remains standing." Elena felt the air leave her lungs. The patio was where families sat on warm summer nights. It was where her mother and father had their first dance at their wedding reception. It was a part of their soul. "But that's insane. It's been there for over 40 years. "It doesn't matter," the lawyer repeated, the words becoming a funeral dirge. "He has an army of lawyers and endless resources. They can tie us up in court for years. They'll file motion after motion, appeal after appeal. They will bleed us dry, Elena. Long before a judge ever hears the merits of our case, we will be bankrupt. Your father's hospital bills are already piling up. This is a checkmate." She stared at the wall behind him, at a framed photo of him and her father holding up a large fish on a boat. Two smiling men from a simpler time. "So what you're telling me," she said, her voice dangerously quiet, "is that there's nothing we can do." Arthur looked down at his hands. "You can take his offer," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's a terrible offer. It's an insult, but it may be all that's left." Defeated, Elena left the office and walked back toward the restaurant. The sun was bright, the sky a mocking, cheerful blue. The neighborhood was waking up. Mrs. Gable was sweeping the front of her bakery. Thomas was setting out flowers in front of his corner shop. These were the people who had watched her grow up, who celebrated their birthdays and anniversaries at Rossi's Trattoria. They were her community. They were her family. As she rounded the corner, her steps slowed. There was something on the front door of the restaurant, a large, garish sheet of paper, the color of sickness. It was taped across the dark wood, right over the small, hand-painted sign that read, "Closed for family emergency." Her heart began to pound a slow, heavy drumbeat against her ribs. She broke into a run, a terrible certainty gripping her. It was a foreclosure notice. The text was stark, printed in thick, black, unfeeling letters. Words like default and public auction and seizure of property screamed at her. Her family's name, Rossi, was printed for all the world to see, branded with failure. It felt like a physical violation, a public stripping of their dignity. She could feel the stares of people passing on the street, their curious glances turning to pity. The shame was a hot flush that crept up her neck. Her hands trembled as she reached out to tear it down. She clawed at the corner, but it was stuck fast with thick industrial tape, the kind that doesn't let go. She pulled and pulled, her nails scraping against the wood, but the notice remained, a stubborn, ugly scar on the face of her home. She finally gave up, slumping against the cold glass of the door, her forehead pressed against the pane. Inside, the restaurant was a tomb. The morning light struggled through the dusty windows, illuminating tables with their chairs stacked upside down, like skeletons at rest. The air was stale, missing its usual symphony of garlic and basil and simmering sauces. It smelled only of coldness and defeat. This place, which had always been a sanctuary of warmth and life, now felt like a mausoleum for her family's dreams. She used her key and let herself in, the jingle of the bell on the door sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. She walked through the dining room, her hand trailing over the backs of chairs. She saw the small nick in the wood of table 7, where she dropped a heavy pot as a clumsy teenager. She saw the faint wine stain on the floor near the bar from Leo's 21st birthday party. Every inch of this place held a story Damian Blackwood wanted to bulldoze and erase. She pushed through the swinging doors into the kitchen. Her kitchen, her father's kitchen, her grandmother's kitchen. The stainless steel counters were cold and sterile. Her father's prized chef's knife lay on the butcher block, exactly where he had left it. She picked it up. The worn wooden handle felt perfect in her palm, a familiar extension of her own hand. It was a tool of creation, of nourishment, of love. In this moment, it felt as useless as her rage. She sank onto a stool, the knife still clutched in her hand, and let the tears come. They weren't the hot, angry tears from the day before. These were cold, silent tears of utter despair. The fight was over. She had lost. Her father's words echoed in her mind. Let it go. Arthur's words. A checkmate. The foreclosure notice on the door. It was all true. She had no money, no power, no options. She had charged headfirst at a fortress and had only succeeded in getting herself thrown in the dirt. She didn't know how long she sat there, in the deepening gloom of the afternoon, the silence of the restaurant pressing in on her. The fight had gone out of her, leaving a vast, empty space where her hope used to be. She was adrift. Her family was about to lose everything, and it was her fault. She hadn't been strong enough. She hadn't been smart enough. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a jarring intrusion into the quiet misery. She ignored it. It buzzed again. With a sigh of irritation, she pulled it out, expecting it to be Leo, calling with more bad news. But it wasn't. The message was from an unknown number. Her finger hovered over the screen, a strange sense of dread and premonition washing over her. She opened it. The text was short, devoid of any greeting or pleasantry. It was as cold and precise as the man who sent it. The Oracle Building, Penthouse Suite, 10 o'clock tonight. Come alone. We have a final proposition to discuss. The text message felt like a cold stone in her pocket. It contained only an address and a time. No name, no explanation, just a summons. Elena knew who it was from. Each step she took on the cracked city pavement felt heavier than the last, pulling her toward a fate she had been fighting with every ounce of her being. She was walking toward Damian Blackwood. She was walking toward surrender. The address was not another sterile office building. It was the Chamberlain Hotel, a relic of old-world money, with a stone facade and a heavy revolving door that seemed to turn with a sound beam. It was a place designed to make people feel small, a neutral ground chosen with the same chilling precision as all his other moves. This wasn't his tower, a place she could invade with her righteous anger. This was a quiet, suffocating space where deals were made and futures were signed away in hushed tones. Inside, the lobby was a cavern of dark wood, polished brass, and deep red carpets that drank the sound of her worn-out boots. The air smelled of leather and lemon oil. A man in a severe suit, someone she had never seen before, was waiting just inside the door. He didn't ask her name. He simply nodded once and said, "This way, miss." He led her not to the public bar, but down a quiet hall to a heavy oak door. He opened it and stepped aside, a silent sentinel. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. This was it, the final act. She expected a room full of lawyers, a long table, a stack of papers that would sign away her family's history. She took a deep breath, the air tasting like dust and defeat, and stepped inside. The room was small, a private study or lounge. A single fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls lined with leather-bound books that looked like they had never been opened. The only other person in the room was Damian Blackwood. He was seated in a deep armchair, a glass of amber liquid swirling in his hand. He wasn't wearing his usual corporate armor, the perfectly tailored suit. Instead, he wore a simple dark sweater and trousers. It was somehow more intimidating. It was personal. He did not stand. He just watched her, his gray eyes following her as she hesitated in the doorway. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the soft clink of ice against his glass. Elena's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She had rehearsed 100 speeches on the walkover, filled with fury and final pleas. Now they all evaporated, leaving only a dry, empty space in her throat. "Please sit," he said. His voice was quiet, without its usual sharp edge, but it was still a command. There was only one other chair, placed directly opposite him. It felt like an interrogation. She crossed the room, her movements stiff, and sank into the leather. It was cold against her back. She refused to let herself feel comfortable. She sat on the edge of the seat, ready to spring up, ready to fight, though she knew there was no fight left. "I assume you have the papers," she said, her own voice sounding thin and brittle. "Let's just get this over with." Damien took a slow sip from his glass. He seemed to be in no hurry at all. He studied her over the rim, his gaze analytical, unnerving. "There are no papers," he said softly. "There are no lawyers." Lena stared at him. Confusion warred with suspicion. This was a trick, another one of his games designed to break her down even further before delivering the final blow. "Then why am I here?" she asked, a sliver of her old defiance returning. "To watch you celebrate? To gloat?" "No," he said, setting his glass down on a small table beside him. The sound was sharp in the quiet room. "I'm here to make you a proposition." He leaned forward slightly, his forearms resting on his knees. The firelight caught the angles of his face, making him look like a predator carved from stone. "I'm not interested in any proposition from you," she shot back, though the words felt hollow. She had no leverage, no power, no ground to stand on. She was here because he had summoned her. She was here because he had won. He ignored her protest, his expression unchanging. "About 6 months ago," he began, his voice low and even, "I ordered food from your restaurant. It was late. I'd been working. I didn't want to go out." Elena's mind reeled. What was he talking about? Takeout? She tried to remember a large order, an unusual request, anything. Nothing came to mind. It was just another night in 1,000 nights of service. "I had the cacio e pepe," he continued, as if sensing her confusion. "A simple dish, so simple that most places get it wrong. They'd use the wrong cheese, the pepper isn't fresh, the pasta water isn't starchy enough. It becomes a clumpy, greasy mess." He paused, his eyes fixed on hers. Yours was not. She could only stare, bewildered. He was talking about her food. The man who had put her father in a hospital bed, who had threatened to destroy her entire world, was critiquing her pasta. The absurdity of it was staggering. "The pecorino was sharp," he said, his voice almost meditative. "The black pepper had that fresh, floral heat. It meant you ground it just before you used it. The pasta was coated, not drowned. It was precise." He leaned back in his chair again, picking up his glass. "It was the best I have ever had." For a moment, a flicker of pride, an automatic reflex from a lifetime in the kitchen, rose in her chest. She immediately smothered it, disgusted with herself. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and bewilderment. "You destroy my family for a plate of pasta?" "I am destroying nothing," he corrected her, his tone hardening just enough to remind her who was in control. "I am a businessman pursuing an asset. That has not changed. But your skill has presented an alternative possibility." Elena's heart began to beat a different rhythm, no longer just fear, but a strange, anxious curiosity. Where was this going? This was worse than a simple, brutal takeover. This was a labyrinth, and she was lost in it. "I am a very private man, Elena," he said, using her first name for the first time. It sounded foreign and wrong coming from his lips. "I value my privacy. I also value excellence. It is rare to find in any field." He took another sip of his drink, letting the silence hang between them again. He was building something, laying each sentence down like a stone in a wall, and she was on the other side, waiting for it to close in on her. "My lawyers have assured me that I will own the deed to your restaurant's property within a month," he stated, a cold reminder of the reality she was facing. The legal challenges are insurmountable for you. Your family's debt is significant. Your father's medical bills will continue to mount. You have no way out. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, hot and sharp. She blinked them back furiously. She would not cry in front of him. She would not give him the satisfaction. Just say what you came to say, she bit out. He nodded as if she had finally caught up to his own train of thought. I am prepared to make all of it go away, he said. Elena's breath caught in her throat. Hope, treacherous and stupid, fluttered for a single painful second before she crushed it. For what? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. What's the price? Damien looked directly into her eyes. The coldness was back, a flat, gray emptiness that chilled her to the bone. You, he said. The word hung in the air, ugly and horrifying. Elena felt a wave of nausea. Her mind flashed with a dozen terrible interpretations, each one worse than the last. She felt the color drain from her face. He saw the look on her face, and a flicker of something, perhaps irritation, crossed his features. Let me be specific, he said, his voice clipped and precise. I am not interested in that kind of arrangement. My offer is far more practical. He set his glass down for the final time and stood up, walking to stand before the fireplace. He stared into the flames, his back to her. For a period of 30 days, you will live in my penthouse. During that time, you will be my exclusive private chef. You will prepare my meals, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. You will cook what I ask you to cook, when I ask you to cook it. You will not leave the residence without my permission. Elena could not process the words. They sounded like a language she didn't understand. Live with him? Be his cook? It was insane. It was the proposition of a madman, a king in a fairy tale demanding some impossible tribute. He turned back to face her, his silhouette framed by the fire. At the end of those 30 days, he said, his voice resonating with absolute authority, all of your family's outstanding debt will be paid in full. By me. The only legal actions is to seize the property at your restaurant's address will be permanently withdrawn. The foreclosure notices will vanish. The hospital bills for your father will be settled. I will sign a legally binding document stating that I, and any company I control, will never again make any attempt to acquire that property. He paused. Rossi's trattoria will be yours, free and clear, forever. The room was utterly silent. Elena's mind was a storm of noise. She felt like she was underwater, the sound of his voice muffled and distant, the world tilting around her. He wasn't just offering to stop his attack. He was offering to save them, to erase every single problem that was crushing her family into dust. The debts that had kept her awake for years, the hospital bills that felt like a ticking bomb, the legal nightmare that had no exit. He was offering her a miracle, and the price was her, not her body, but her pride, her freedom, her craft. He wanted to take the one thing that was truly hers, the soul of her family, and make it his private property for a month. He wanted to turn her passion into a service, her love into a transaction. He wanted to own her art. Why? She finally managed to choke out. Why would you do this? You can hire any chef in the world. Why me? Because the other chefs are just employees, he answered, his voice devoid of any emotion. Their food is technically perfect, but it has no character. It is sterile. That plate of pasta I had from your restaurant. It was not sterile, but there was history in it. He looked at her, and for a fleeting second she saw something other than coldness in his eyes. It was a flicker of profound, aching loneliness. It vanished as quickly as it appeared. I am buying something that cannot otherwise be bought, he finished. He walked back to the table and picked up a small, black business card. He held it out to her. Elena didn't move. Her hands felt like lead. You have 24 hours to decide, he said. If I do not hear from you by this time tomorrow, the offer is rescinded, and my lawyers will proceed as planned. The choice is yours. She still didn't take the card. After a moment, he placed it on the table in front of her. The black rectangle stood out starkly against the polished, dark wood. Her name wasn't on it, just a number. Without another word, Damien Blackwood turned and walked out of the room, leaving her alone with the crackling fire and the impossible choice. The heavy door clicked shut behind him, the sound echoing like a prison gate. Elena sat frozen in the leather chair. Her gaze was fixed on the card. One phone call. That's all it would take. One phone call to sell 30 days of her life, 30 days of her soul, to the man who had almost destroyed her. She thought of her father, lying weak and worried in that sterile hospital bed, the beeping machines a constant reminder of his fragility. She pictured the foreclosure notice on the restaurant door, a public declaration of their failure. She saw Leo's terrified face, begging her to be careful, to not provoke the monster. The monster was not asking for a fight anymore. He was asking to be fed. Disgust churned in her stomach, a bitter, acidic wave. The arrogance of it, the sheer, unadulterated power. To believe he could just buy her, like a piece of furniture for his cold, empty home. The rage was still there, a hot coal buried under a mountain of shock and despair. But for the first time, a different feeling seeped through the cracks, a cold, terrifying calculation. This was a way out, a horrible, humiliating, disgusting way out. But it was a way out. It might be the only way out. She stared at the empty chair where he had sat, the indentation in the leather slowly fading, as if he had never been there at all. But he was there. He was everywhere. In her father's injuries, in their debts, in her fear. Now he was offering to become her jailer and her savior, all in one. Elena's hands began to tremble, not with rage this time, but with the sheer, crushing weight of the decision. Her freedom or her family's future, her pride or her father's legacy. She looked from the card to the fire, her world reduced to this one silent room, caught between the revulsion of his offer and the terrifying, undeniable truth that she might have to accept it. The city air felt thin and sharp in her lungs as Elena walked away from the sterile meeting room. Every sound was magnified. The distant siren, the rumble of a passing subway train, the clipped clicking of her own heels on the pavement. Each noise was a needle against her skin. Damian Blackwood's voice was a low hum in her mind, a snake coiling around her thoughts. 30 days. Live in his home. Be his private chef. The words were absurd, a plot from a dark fairy tale, yet they were attached to the only lifeline she had been thrown. All debts erased. The restaurant safe. Forever. She drove home in a stupor, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. The familiar streets of her neighborhood seemed alien, the warm brick buildings like strangers. She saw the darkened windows of Rossi's trattoria, and a wave of nausea washed over her. It was more than a building. It was her grandmother's laughter echoing off the kitchen walls. It was her father teaching her how to properly hold a knife. It was the place she and Leo had hidden under tables as children, breathing in the scent of garlic and simmering tomatoes. Blackwood wasn't just trying to buy property, he was trying to buy their memories. She parked the car and sat in the silence, the engine ticking as it cooled. The proposition was an act of profound arrogance. He believed he could purchase a person's life for 1 month. He wanted to own her skill, her time, her very presence. It was demeaning. It was a violation. And yet, the alternative was watching her father's legacy be bulldozed into rubble, legally and financially. She closed her eyes, and all she could see were the foreclosure notices, their stark red ink like blood on the door. When she finally climbed the stairs to the small apartment above the restaurant, Leo was waiting for her. He was pacing the length of their small living room, his young face etched with worry. He stopped the moment he saw her, his eyes scanning her for any sign of hope or disaster. He didn't have to wait long. Her expression told him everything. Ellie, what happened? What did he say? His voice was tight with anxiety. Elena sank onto the worn floral sofa, the springs groaning in protest. She felt 100 years old. For a moment she considered lying. She thought about telling him it was over, that Blackwood had won, that they should just pack their things. It would be easier than saying the truth aloud. But she had never lied to her brother. She couldn't start now. She took a breath, the words feeling like ash in her mouth. He made an offer. Leo's eyes flickered with a dangerous sliver of hope. An offer? To buy us out? A better one? Elena shook her head slowly, her gaze fixed on a crack in the ceiling. No, not that. She explained it to him. Every humiliating detail. The 30 days, the penthouse, the cooking. As she spoke, the hope in Leo's face curdled into disbelief, then horror. What? He whispered, his voice cracking. He wants you to live with him? As his cook? The question hung in the air, grotesque and unbelievable. That's the deal, Elena said, her own voice flat and empty. No, Leo said, his voice rising. He started pacing again, running a hand through his dark hair. Absolutely not, Ellie. No, you can't. That's insane. It's the only deal on the table, Leo. It's not a deal, it's a trap, he exclaimed, whirling to face her. Don't you see, this man put Dad in the hospital? He's a monster. What do you think will happen to you alone in his house for a month? The restaurant, the money, none of it is worth that risk. It's not worth you. Tears of frustration and fear welled in his eyes. We'll declare bankruptcy. We'll start over. We can move, get a small apartment somewhere else. I'll get another mom. You can cook anywhere. We'll manage. We've always managed. His words, meant to be comforting, felt like tiny stones being thrown at her. Start over? Where? How? With what? He didn't understand the depth of their failure. He didn't see the mountain of debt that would follow them even after bankruptcy. He saw it as losing a business. She saw it as losing their home, their identity, their father's entire life's work. It's not that simple, she said, her voice strained. Bankruptcy means Dad loses everything he ever worked for, everything his parents worked for. He'll have nothing, and we'll have nothing. We live here, Leo. This is our home. A home isn't worth your safety, he shot back, his voice pleading. Mom would never have wanted this. She would want you safe, away from men like him. The mention of their mother was a low blow, and it struck its mark. A sharp pain lanced through Elena's chest. He was right. Their mother, who had died 5 years ago, would have been terrified. She would have barricaded the door herself. But their mother wasn't here. It was just Elena, and the impossible weight of their family's survival rested squarely on her shoulders. He promised to leave us alone, she whispered, trying to convince herself as much as him. He'd clear the debts, all of them. He promises? Leo scoffed, a bitter, humorless laugh escaping him. His promises are worthless, Ellie. He's a shark. You don't make a deal with a shark and hope it doesn't bite you. You're just getting into the water with it. He knelt in front of her, his hands finding hers. They were cold and trembling. Please, Ellie, don't do this. We'll find another way. I swear, we will find another way. His desperation was a mirror of her own. She looked into her younger brother's terrified eyes and felt her resolve splinter. For a moment, she let herself believe him. Maybe they could run. Maybe they could disappear and start fresh. 2 kids against the world. But then the image of her father's face, pale and still in a hospital bed, flooded her mind. They couldn't run. Their roots were here, tangled up in the foundation of the trattoria, and their father was the deepest root of all. She gently pulled her hands away from his. I need to think, she said, her voice hollow. She left him in the living room and walked down the creaking hallway to the restaurant's tiny cluttered office. The air was stale, thick with the smell of old paper and dust. This was her father's sanctuary, the place where he balanced the books and dreamed of new specials. Now it felt like a tomb. She switched on the small desk lamp, and its yellow light illuminated the battlefield. There they were, the foreclosure notice stapled to a stack of legal threats, the pile of unpaid invoices from their suppliers, each one a testament to their slow decline. And on top, a new crisp envelope from St. Michael's Hospital. Her fingers trembled as she tore it open. It was only the first bill, an itemized list for the emergency room and the initial tests. The number at the bottom made her stomach clench. It was more money than they had seen in months. And this was just the beginning. There would be so many more. Each number was a shackle. Each overdue notice was a bar on a cage. Leo's words about starting over were a sweet, childish fantasy. They were not just in debt, they were buried under it. Blackwood hadn't just pushed them. He had engineered a landslide. There was no climbing out. He was offering to make the mountain disappear. All she had to do was walk into his gilded cage for 30 days. her pride for their freedom, her dignity for her father's legacy. Later that afternoon, she drove back to the hospital. The antiseptic smell hit her the moment she walked through the doors, a sterile scent that always made her feel cold from the inside out. She walked down the quiet, polished corridors, the soft squeak of her shoes the only sound. Marco was awake when she entered his room. He was propped up slightly, staring out the window at a gray, unforgiving sky. He looked smaller in the stark white bed, his once strong hands resting limply on the thin blanket. The spark in his eyes, the one that always lit up when he talked about a perfectly ripe tomato or the scent of baking bread, was gone. In its place was a quiet, weary resignation. He turned his head as she approached, managing a weak smile. "Ellie, Maya Kara." His voice was raspy. "You shouldn't be here all the time. You need to rest." "I wanted to see you," she said, pulling a chair close to his bed. She took his hand. It felt fragile. They sat in silence for a few minutes. He didn't ask about Blackwood. He didn't ask about the restaurant. It was a silence so heavy with the unspoken fears that it felt louder than any conversation. Finally, he squeezed her hand faintly. "You know," he began, his gaze drifting back to the window. Maybe it's for the best. This place, the restaurant, it's a lot of work, a lot of worry. For you and Leo." Elena's heart twisted. He was trying to protect her. He was trying to release her from the burden he felt he had become. "Maybe a new start would be good," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "We sell. We find a small place. You wouldn't have to fight so hard all the time." He turned to look at her, and in his tired eyes, she saw the truth. He wasn't hopeful about a new start. He was defeated. He had already surrendered. He was watching his life's work, his father's work before him, crumble to dust, and he was telling her to let it go because he couldn't bear to watch her get hurt fighting for it. He believed he had failed, and that belief was destroying him more surely than any physical injury. And in that moment, Elena knew what she had to do. She couldn't let his story end this way. She couldn't let him spend the rest of his days believing he had lost everything, that his legacy was one of failure. The restaurant wasn't just a business. It was the story of his life. To let it die would be to let a part of him die too. She had to save it, not just for herself or for Leo, but for him. She leaned forward and kissed his forehead. "Don't you worry about a thing, Papa," she said, forcing a strength into her voice she did not feel. "Everything is going to be all right. I promise." He gave her another weak smile, but his eyes were filled with a deep, bottomless sadness. He didn't believe her. Back in her small room, the world outside her window faded to a blur of twilight and distant city lights. The argument with Leo, the crushing weight of the bills, the look of utter defeat on her father's face, it all swirled into one terrible, clear thought. There was no choice, there was only the price. She found her phone, her fingers feeling clumsy and numb. She pulled up the text message from the unknown number, Damian Blackwood's summons. Her thumb hovered over the call icon for a long time. Every instinct screamed at her to throw the phone against the wall, to run, to listen to Leo. But the image of her father's broken spirit was branded onto her mind. This wasn't about pride anymore. It was about love. A fierce, desperate love that demanded sacrifice. With a shuddering breath that felt like it was being torn from her soul, she pressed the button. The phone rang once, twice. Then a click. Silence. He didn't say hello. He just waited, his silence radiating a cold, absolute confidence. He knew she would call. He knew he had won. Elena swallowed, her throat dry. She closed her eyes, picturing her father's smile as he pulled a perfect loaf of bread from the oven. She held onto that memory like a shield. Her voice was a ragged whisper, barely audible, but it carried across the line, clear and final. "I accept." The taxi's meter ticked over with a soft, indifferent click. Each sound was another coin dropping into the chasm that had opened in Elena's life. Outside the window, the familiar streets of her neighborhood blurred into the slick, anonymous avenues of downtown. The warm brick and glowing windows of her world gave way to cold glass and steel towers that pierced a starless sky. She clutched the worn canvas bag on her lap. Inside were 3 changes of clothes and a small, heavy roll of leather. Her father's knives. The weight of them was both a comfort and a curse, a tangible link to the life she was leaving behind for 30 days. Her own life felt impossibly distant, like a story someone else had lived. The car slowed, pulling up to a building that did not seem to have an entrance. It was just a sheer wall of dark glass and polished black stone, a monument to wealth so vast it felt obscene. A doorman in a crisp gray uniform materialized from the shadows. His face was a polite professional mask that did not quite hide the flicker of curiosity in his eyes as he took in Elena's simple jeans and the anxiety clinging to her like a second skin. He opened her door without a word, his gloved hand hovering as if she might contaminate the air. She didn't need him to announce her. He clearly knew who she was and why she was here. Another one of Mr. Blackwood's arrangements. Elena stepped out, the cool night air hitting her face. She looked up and up until her neck ached. The tower seemed to go on forever, disappearing into the dark clouds. She was a fly about to be trapped in a very tall, very expensive web. Taking a deep breath that did nothing to calm the frantic beating of her heart, she walked through the silent, revolving doors. The lobby was cavernous and empty, a gallery of echoing silence. The only sound was the faint hum of the ventilation system and the clack of her worn boots on the marble floor. It smelled of nothing. Not perfume, not food, not life. Just clean, sterile air. A private elevator stood waiting, its doors open like a metallic mouth. There was no button to press. As she stepped inside, the doors slid shut with a soft hiss, and the car began to ascend. There was no lurch, just a smooth, silent glide upwards that made her stomach feel hollow. Her ears popped. She swallowed hard, her knuckles white where she gripped the strap of her bag. This was it. The last chance to turn back was gone. She was rising into the sky, into his world, and leaving her own far below on the ground. The elevator stopped as silently as it had started. The doors opened directly into a living space. And there he was. Damian Blackwood stood in the center of the room, framed by a wall of glass that looked out over the entire glittering city. He was dressed in a simple black shirt and dark trousers, yet he still looked like he was wearing a suit of armor. His posture was perfect, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. He watched her step out of the elevator with the same cold, assessing gaze he'd had in his office. It was the look of a man examining a new acquisition. The penthouse was breathtakingly large and painfully empty. The floors were polished concrete. The furniture was black leather and chrome, stark and angular. There were no photographs, no books, no clutter. Just vast, empty spaces and a few pieces of abstract art that looked angry and cold. The city lights poured in, but they offered no warmth, only a distant, impersonal glow. It was less a home and more a beautiful, sterile cage. He didn't say hello. He simply gestured for her to follow him. His voice, when it came, was as clipped and devoid of warmth as the room itself. This will be your residence for the next 30 days. He led her down a long, white hallway. The echo of their footsteps was the only sound. This is your room. He pushed open a door. The room was comfortable with a large bed and its own view of the city, but it was as impersonal as a high-end hotel suite. There was a closet, a dresser, and an attached bathroom with gleaming white tiles. Your personal effects can go here. Elena dropped her bag on the floor. The soft thud was absorbed by the silence. She didn't move to unpack. It felt too permanent. Damian watched her, his gray eyes missing nothing. There are rules, Miss Rossi. You would do well to remember them. He ticked them off as if reading from a legal document. 1, Bamber, you are here for one purpose, to cook. You will prepare 3 meals a day for me, breakfast at 7, lunch at 1, and dinner at 8. Precisely. He paused, letting the word hang in the air. 2, the menu is my choice. You will be provided with a list of ingredients each morning. You will use them. You will not improvise with things you find more familiar. The jab was subtle but sharp. He was reminding her of her place, of the world she came from, and how it had no value here. 3, he continued, his voice dropping slightly, becoming even colder. You will not leave this penthouse. Not for any reason. Everything you require will be provided. Your phone will be restricted to contact with your brother for updates on your father's condition. All other communications are forbidden. The security staff has been instructed. Do not test them. Elena's jaw tightened. A prisoner. He was making it explicitly clear. She wasn't a chef. She was an inmate. She met his gaze, refusing to look away, refusing to show the fear that was churning in her stomach. And what if my father gets worse? What if there's an emergency? A flicker of something, perhaps annoyance, crossed his face. In the unlikely event of a genuine family emergency, you will be escorted to the hospital and you will be escorted back. You will not be alone for a single moment. Is that understood? She wanted to scream at him. She wanted to throw her bag at his perfectly composed face. But she thought of her father in that hospital bed, of the foreclosure notices on the restaurant door, of Leo's terrified face. And so she bit back the rage, swallowing it down until it felt like a hot coal in her chest. She gave a single tight nod. Understood. Good. He seemed satisfied, as if a dog had just learned a new command. He turned to leave, then stopped in the doorway. One more thing. Your personal items. I trust you brought what you need for your work. Elena's hand instinctively went to the leather roll inside her bag. I have my knives. His lips curved into something that was not a smile. It was a look of cold, predatory satisfaction. Excellent. I have a rather specific request for your first dinner service tonight. He glanced at his watch, a slim silver object on his wrist. You have 3 hours. I expect you to be ready. He turned and walked away, his footsteps receding down the hall, leaving her alone in the silent white room. For a long moment, Elena didn't move. She just stood there, listening to the sound of her own breathing. The air was too clean, too still. She missed the smell of garlic and basil, the clatter of pans from the kitchen, the sound of her brother's laughter. She closed her eyes, and for a second she could almost pretend she was back at Rossi's, the warmth of the ovens on her skin. But when she opened them, she was still here, in this cold, perfect prison. With a deep, shuddering breath, she knelt and unzipped her bag. She pushed aside the few clothes she had packed and pulled out the leather roll. Unfurling it on the bed felt like a ritual. The worn leather, stained and soft from years of use, smelled faintly of her father, of home. There was his heavy chef's knife, its wooden handle smooth and shaped to his grip. There was the paring knife he used for peeling apples for her when she was a child. The boning knife, thin and flexible. Each one was a memory. Each one was a piece of her soul. She ran her finger along the cool steel of the main blade. This was her armor. This was her weapon. She changed out of her jeans and into a simple black t-shirt and chef's pants. Tying her fiery red hair up into a tight, no-nonsense bun, she felt a sliver of her old self returning. She was not just a prisoner here. She was a chef, and he had challenged her. Whatever he threw at her, she would not break. She would cook. She would do her job with a cold, perfect precision that matched his own. She would give him nothing of herself, nothing of the love and passion that made her food special. She would give him only technique, an empty, flawless meal for an empty, flawless man. Clutching the knife roll, she walked out of the bedroom and toward the kitchen. It was visible from the main living area, a vast, open-plan space of stainless steel and black granite. It looked like it had been lifted from a magazine. There were 2 massive refrigerators, a wine cooler the size of a closet, and a stove with at least a dozen burners. Every gadget and appliance imaginable was built seamlessly into the countertops. It was a chef's dream, and it was completely and utterly soulless. There were no smudges on the steel, no stray drips of olive oil, no lingering scent of a past meal. The air was sterile. It was a laboratory for food, not a place where it was made with love. On the central island, a pristine white sheet of paper was laid out. Next to it was an astonishing array of ingredients, already washed, prepped, and arranged with surgical precision. It was an arsenal of fine dining: foie gras, truffles, scallops the size of her palm, a whole duck, delicate microgreens, and bottles of sauces she'd only read about in textbooks. She picked up the paper. At the top, in crisp typed letters, it read, "Dinner, 8 o'clock." The menu followed. It was not Italian, it was not rustic. It was a 7-course classical French tasting menu. Each dish was more complex and technical than the last. Seared foie gras with a fig reduction, scallop crudo with a citrus vinaigrette, duck consommé, pan sardine duck breast with cherry sauce, a cheese course, a pre-dessert, a final towering chocolate souffle. Elena read the list, and a slow, cold anger began to burn through her. This wasn't a request. This was a statement. He had looked at her, a girl who made pasta and meatballs in a humble trattoria, and he had handed her the culinary equivalent of climbing a mountain. He was testing her. He was trying to make her fail, to prove that she was beneath him, that her skills were provincial and unsophisticated. He wanted to humiliate her in the one place she felt powerful, her kitchen. Except this wasn't her kitchen. Her eyes scanned the incredible array of equipment, a sous vide machine, a thermal circulator, a blast chiller. He had given her all the tools. He had removed every possible excuse. The only variable left was her. Could she do it? The techniques were complex, things she had studied but rarely practiced in the warm, chaotic world of Rossi's. This was the food of silent, formal dining rooms, of hushed whispers and clinking silver. It was his world. For a moment, doubt washed over her. It was a cold, terrifying wave. What if she couldn't do it? What if she burned the sauce, or the souffle fell, or the duck was overcooked? The shame would be exactly what he wanted. He would stand over her, his cold eyes filled with triumph, and she would have nothing. Nothing. Then she looked down at the knife roll in her hand. She thought of her father, how he could break down a whole lamb with his eyes practically closed, his hands moving with an old, ingrained grace. She thought of her Nona, who could make a feast from almost nothing, whose love you could taste in every single bite. Their legacy was in her hands, in her blood. He thought he could break her with fancy ingredients and complicated French words. He had no idea who he was dealing with. He had challenged her profession, and that was a line she would not let him cross. This was no longer just about survival. It was about pride. She walked over to the immense steel island and set down her father's knives. With a decisive tug, she unrolled the leather, the familiar sound echoing slightly in the vast, quiet room. She picked up the heavy chef's knife, its weight settling into her palm like an old friend. The handle was worn smooth, a perfect fit. She looked across the open space toward the living area where she knew he was watching her from the shadows, waiting for her to falter. Elena looked at the state-of-the-art but soulless kitchen, a battlefield of chrome and steel. She took a deep, steadying breath, the first one that felt truly hers since she had walked through his door. Then she raised her chin, met the darkness where she knew his eyes were, and gave him a defiant nod, accepting the culinary challenge. The war had begun. The first dish was a chilled cucumber soup. Elena placed it on the vast dark wood of the dining table. Damian Blackwood sat at the far end, a solitary king in his glass castle. He picked up his spoon without looking at her. She retreated to the kitchen, her jaw tight. This was not cooking. It was warfare conducted with sauces and reductions. For 10 days, the battle raged in silence. Elena produced flawless French cuisine, one technically perfect dish after another. Seared scallops with saffron risotto, duck confit with a cherry reduction. Each plate was a work of art, and each plate was completely dead. There was no love in the food, no joy. It was the cooking of a brilliant machine, and she knew he could taste it. Their evenings fell into a tense rhythm. She would serve, he would eat. The only sounds were the clinking of his silver fork against porcelain. He never praised the food, nor did he criticize it. He would simply eat, his gray eyes occasionally lifting to watch her. His gaze was heavy, analytical, like he was trying to solve a puzzle. She met his stare each time, her own eyes a cool, defiant green. Let him look, she would not break. At night after he retired, she would lean against the cold countertop and call her brother. Leo's voice was a lifeline frayed with worry. She would ask about their father, her own voice a whisper. He was stable, Leo said. He asked about her all the time. A familiar ache would tighten in her chest. She imagined her father in that hospital bed, his strong hands still. What do you tell him, she'd ask. Leo would reply, I tell him you're on a special catering job, that you're making us proud. The lie tasted like ash. She was a prisoner, cooking for the man who had put her father there. On the 10th night, she served a poached loin of lamb. He took 2 bites, then placed his fork down with a soft click. The lamb is executed flawlessly, he said, his voice cutting the silence. Elena stopped on her way to the kitchen. He looked up, his eyes pinning her in place. The seasoning is precise. The temperature is exact. He paused. And yet, it tastes of nothing. Her heart gave a sharp, angry thump. I'm not sure what you mean. The recipe was followed without deviation. A recipe is a set of instructions, Miss Rossi. It is not a story, it is not a feeling. This, he gestured to the plate, is an instruction manual. She clenched her fists. You requested a 7-course French tasting menu. This is what that food is. It's about technique, is it? He asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Or is this just another way to fight me? The accusation hung in the air, sharp and true. She could not deny it. Every perfect, soulless dish was an act of defiance. It said, you can buy my skill, but you cannot buy my heart. She lifted her chin. I am fulfilling my end of our agreement. He stared at her for a long moment, then finished the meal in that same infuriating silence. The tension only grew thicker. She started to notice things about him. The way he stared out the window, his expression unguarded and deeply lonely. She saw sadness in the lines around his eyes when he thought she was not looking. For a fleeting second, she would almost feel pity. Then she would remember her father, and the pity would curdle back into anger. The breaking point arrived on the 15th day. She created a deconstructed bouillabaisse, a clear fish consommé served in a glass teapot, to be poured over artfully arranged fish. It was a culinary insult delivered on a $300 plate. She set it before him. He poured the broth, took a single spoonful and chewed slowly. His jaw was tight. He put the spoon down. His gray eyes, usually so cold, were blazing. What is this? He asked, his voice low with restrained fury. It's bouillabaisse, she answered. No, he said, this is not food. It's arrogant. It's empty. It's nothing. With a sudden, violent movement, he slammed his fork on the table. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot. Elena flinched. I am tired of this, he snarled, pushing his chair back. He was tall and imposing, his perfect composure gone. I am tired of your perfectly executed soulless meals. I am tired of this silent rebellion. He paced before the table. I could have hired any of 100 chefs, chefs with more training, more accolades than you. He stopped and faced her. But I didn't want them. I wanted you. I wanted the food from that little restaurant. The food I tasted once, months ago. Elena stared at him, her mind reeling. He had eaten at their restaurant. You stand here making this technical garbage, he spat the word out. You think you're punishing me? You're just proving you're a coward. You're hiding behind technique because you're afraid to actually cook. He stepped closer, his voice a fierce command. I don't want a technician. I don't want a robot. I want a chef, so stop it. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. And make me something that actually means something. He turned and strode out of the room. The door closed with a definitive click. Elena stood frozen, her heart hammering. His words echoed. Make me something that means something. She had prepared for a battle of wills, not for him to demand her heart on a plate. She sank into a dining chair. The anger that had fueled her was gone, replaced by shock and a confusing sense of understanding. He was a lonely man eating meaningless food in a gilded cage. He had called her a coward, and maybe he was right. She had been hiding, using her skill as a shield. Her true cooking was too vulnerable, too full of love and memory. But as she sat there, his challenge turned over in her mind. It was not a surrender. It was a dare. He had dismissed her cold precision and demanded her soul. A slow, determined fire began to burn. Fine. She would give it to him. She would stop hiding. She would use the warmth and memory her family had passed down for generations. Elena stood up and walked into the cold kitchen. She ignored the fancy equipment. From the refrigerator, she pulled out carrots, celery, and an onion. She picked up her father's old, worn chef's knife. The wooden handle felt warm and right in her hand. She placed the onion on the cutting board. All right, Mr. Blackwood, she thought, the blade hovering. You want something that means something? She would cook him her history. She would see what it did to the man who lived in a house with no heart. The challenge echoed in the silence of the sterile kitchen. Make something that means something. Lena stood before the gleaming chrome refrigerator the next morning, Damien's words ringing in her ears. For days, she had fought him with his own weapons, precision, coldness, and technical perfection. She had cooked meals that were flawless but empty, each dish a silent act of defiance. It had been exhausting, a battle that left her feeling hollow. But his frustration, the slam of his fork on the table, had revealed a crack in his armor. He wasn't just a machine to be fed. He was a man starved of something more than food. She closed the refrigerator door, ignoring the expensive cuts of meat and exotic ingredients. Her war of attrition was over. It was time for a different strategy. She walked to her small bag in the corner of the vast kitchen, unzipping it carefully. Inside, nestled amongst her few clothes, was the familiar worn leather roll. She untied the laces and unfurled it on the cold steel counter. Her father's knives lay there, their wooden handles worn smooth by years of loving use. She picked up the small paring knife, its weight familiar and comforting in her palm. This was her real arsenal, not the soulless, state-of-the-art equipment that filled this kitchen, but the legacy she carried in her hands. He wanted meaning. Fine. She would give him meaning. She would give him a memory. But it wouldn't be his. It would be hers. She would cook the one thing that meant safety, that meant love, that meant home. The dish her Nona used to make for her when she was a little girl, sick with a fever. A simple, rustic minestrone soup. Let him sneer at its humility. Let him mock its peasant origins. She was done trying to impress him. Now she would try to reach him, even if it was just to prove he had something inside him left to be reached. The work was a ritual, a meditation. The rhythmic tap of the knife on the cutting board was a familiar prayer. Carrots, celery, onions, the holy trinity of Italian cooking, diced into small, imperfect cubes. She didn't measure with perfect precision. She measured with her heart, the way her grandmother had taught her. A little more onion because it added sweetness. A little less celery because its flavor could be sharp. The air, usually sterile and smelling faintly of cleaning products, began to change. It started to smell like a real kitchen. It started to smell like Rossi's trattoria on a quiet weekday morning. She sautéed the vegetables in a heavy-bottomed pot, the gentle sizzle a comforting sound. She added garlic, letting it turn golden and fragrant. Then, crushed tomatoes from a can, a splash of wine and rich vegetable broth. She thought of her Nona, a stout woman with flour-dusted hands and a laugh that could fill a room. She remembered sitting on a stool in a warm, cramped kitchen, watching those same hands work magic with the simplest ingredients. When the flu had her shivering under a mountain of blankets, this soup was the only thing that could make her feel better. It was more than food. It was a hug in a bowl. As the soup simmered, filling the penthouse with the deep, savory aroma of herbs and vegetables, Elena felt a shift inside her. The anger that had been her constant companion for weeks began to soften at the edges. It was still there, a hard knot of resentment for what this man had done to her family. But it was joined by something else, a quiet confidence, a sense of purpose that went beyond simple rebellion. She was no longer just his prisoner, his chef. She was Elena Rossi, and she was going to feed this man's soul, whether he liked it or not. When evening came, she set the table as she always did, one single, perfect white plate, one set of heavy silver cutlery, one crystal glass. But tonight, instead of a series of intricate, small plates, she brought out only one thing, a deep, earthenware bowl filled with the steaming, colorful soup. A piece of crusty bread, which she had baked herself that afternoon, lay beside it. She placed it before him without a word and retreated to her usual spot at the other end of the long marble table. Damien looked down at the bowl, his brow furrowed in confusion, then tightened with what looked like contempt. He glanced up at her, his cold gray eyes questioning. This was not the culinary masterpiece he had implicitly demanded. This was soup. Simple, common soup. Elena met his gaze, her heart thumping a steady, defiant rhythm against her ribs. She didn't flinch. She just waited. He picked up his spoon, a gesture of pure dismissal. He was humoring her, this little cook, with her sentimental notions. He dipped the spoon into the broth, lifting it to his lips with an air of bored obligation. And then he paused. The aroma hit him first. It wasn't complex or sophisticated. It was warm. It smelled of earth, of hearth, of something honest and real. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before finally tasting it. Elena watched him, holding her breath. She expected a cutting remark, a sarcastic comment about her return to rustic simplicity, but there was only silence. A profound, echoing silence that seemed to absorb all the tension in the room. He took another spoonful, and then another. His movements were slow, almost mechanical, as if he wasn't consciously controlling his own hand. And then she saw it. It was not a grand, dramatic shattering. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible change. The rigid line of his jaw softened. The icy control in his eyes wavered, replaced by a flicker of something she had never seen there before. It was a deep, raw, and unguarded sadness. His gaze was no longer on the soup or on her, or on the panoramic view of the city lights outside the window. He was looking at something far away, something lost in the distant past. A ghost had just walked into the room and sat down beside him, and only he could see it. His hand, holding the spoon, stopped halfway to his mouth. For a long, stretched moment, he simply sat there, frozen. A statue of a powerful man suddenly confronted by a forgotten weakness. The mask of Damian Blackwood, the ruthless tycoon, had slipped, and beneath it was just a man. A man with a wound so deep that a simple bowl of soup could make it ache. The moment broke as suddenly as it had arrived. With a sharp, almost violent motion, he pushed the chair back. The legs scraped loudly against the polished floor. He stood up, his face once again a mask of cold indifference, but his eyes couldn't quite hide the tremor. He looked at the half-finished bowl of soup on the table as if it were an accusation. Without a single word, without even a glance in her direction, he turned and strode out of the dining room, his footsteps echoing down the long, empty hall until they disappeared. Elena was left alone in the vast, silent space. The only sounds were the distant hum of the city and the frantic beating of her own heart. She looked at the abandoned bowl, the spoon resting beside it. She had done it. She had broken through his defenses. She had landed a blow, not with anger or defiance, but with a memory of love. But there was no triumph in it. She had expected to feel a sense of victory, of vindication. Instead, a strange and unsettling feeling washed over her. The glimpse she had seen behind his mask hadn't revealed a monster. It had revealed a profound and aching sorrow. She had wanted to hurt him, to make him feel a fraction of the pain he had caused her family. But the pain she had uncovered felt ancient, a part of his very foundation. It was harder to hate a man when you had seen his ghosts. It was harder to fight an enemy when you realized he was already fighting a war inside himself. She slowly began to clear the table, her mind racing. Who was he? What could possibly have happened to him to create such a fortress around his heart? The penthouse, which had felt like a prison, now felt like a mausoleum, a beautiful empty tomb for a man who was still breathing. Later that night, the silence of the apartment was absolute. Elena couldn't sleep. She had cleaned the kitchen until it gleamed, scrubbing away the warmth she had brought into it, trying to scrub away the image of his face. It was no use. The memory of that fleeting sadness in his eyes was seared into her mind. She wandered through the dark living space, the city lights painting long shadows on the floor. She knew he was in his office, the thin sliver of light under the door the only sign of his presence. She had been tidying up earlier, collecting an empty water glass from a side table, when she had noticed he'd left his office door slightly ajar. Curiosity, a feeling she had suppressed for weeks, got the better of her. She had planned to just grab the glass and leave, but her feet carried her closer. She told herself she was just doing her job, cleaning up. She pushed the door open a little wider. The room was dark, save for a single desk lamp that cast a warm, isolated pool of light onto the large mahogany desk. He wasn't there. He must have gone to his bedroom. The room was as immaculate and impersonal as the rest of the penthouse. Books arranged by on, pens aligned in a perfect row, but something was out of place. Lying in the center of the desk, directly in the lamplight, was a small rectangular object. It looked as if it had been placed there, looked at, and then left behind. Drawn by an invisible force, Elena stepped into the room. Her bare feet were silent on the cold floor. She approached the desk and looked down. It was an old photograph, its corners softened with age. Its colors faded to a gentle sepia tone. It showed a woman and a young boy standing in what looked like a small park. The woman was beautiful, with a wide, radiant smile that seemed to lit up the entire frame. Her arm was wrapped protectively around the boy's shoulders. But it was the boy who held Elena's gaze. He was small, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, dressed in a slightly oversized jacket. He wasn't smiling like the woman. He was looking directly at the camera with an expression of solemn, heartbreaking gravity. His hand was clutching a small toy car, but his other hand was lost in the folds of the woman's dress. And his eyes, they were large, dark, and filled with a sadness that seemed too heavy for such a young child to carry. Elena leaned closer, her breath catching in her throat. She knew those eyes. They were not the cold, calculating gray eyes of the man who ruled this empty kingdom. They were the eyes she had just seen an hour ago, staring back at her over a half-eaten bowl of minestrone soup. Elena's fingers trembled as she gently placed the photograph back on the cold glass of the desk. The image of the smiling woman and the small, sad-eyed boy seemed to burn into her memory. She looked at her own reflection in the polished surface, a ghost in this vast, silent apartment. For the first time since she had arrived, the anger churning in her gut was joined by a new, unsettling feeling. It was a sliver of curiosity, a dangerous question she couldn't push away. Who was this boy, and why did his sadness feel so familiar? The following days were different. The oppressive hostility that had defined their interactions began to fray at the edges. Damien no longer left the table abruptly after a few silent, evaluative bites. He would stay, finishing his meal, his gray eyes watching her from across the long, dark table. The silence between them changed. It was no longer a weapon, a heavy blanket of animosity. It became a space filled with unspoken questions, a quiet observation. It was the silence of two people in a lifeboat, aware of the vast, cold ocean around them and the fragile vessel keeping them afloat. Then one evening, while Elena was searing lamb chops seasoned with rosemary and garlic, she felt a presence. She turned from the stove, her hand tight on the pan. Damien was standing in the doorway of the kitchen, leaning against the frame. He was still in his impeccable dark suit, a stark figure against the warm, fragrant chaos of her workspace. He wasn't looking at her face. His gaze was fixed on her hands, on the swift, practiced way she moved her father's knife, dicing onions with a speed born of 1,000 nights in her own restaurant. The rhythmic tap of the blade on the cutting board was the only sound. He didn't say anything for a long time. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. She felt exposed, as if he were reading the history of her family in the worn wooden handle of the knife. Finally, his voice, low and quiet, cut through the sounds of the kitchen. "That knife is old." It was not a question. It was an observation, stripped of his usual arrogance. Elena didn't stop her work. "It was my father's," she said, her voice tight, "and his father's before him." He nodded slowly, his eyes still on the blade. "He taught you how to cook?" Another quiet question. She scraped the onions into a sizzling pan, the fragrant steam rising between them. "My grandmother taught me first," she admitted, the words feeling like a betrayal. "My father taught me how to run a kitchen, how to be a chef." She expected a sarcastic remark, a comment about how that was working out for her. But none came. He just watched, a silent, brooding statue in the doorway. This became a new ritual. Damien would appear into the kitchen as she prepared dinner. He never offered to help. He simply watched, a ghost at the edge of her world. He would ask quiet, simple questions. "What is that spice? Why do you add the salt at the end?" His inquiries were technical, detached. But Elena knew they were more than that. He was trying to understand something. He was trying to understand her. She answered in clipped professional tones, keeping a wall between them. Yet, with every question he asked about Rossi's trattoria, a brick in that wall loosened. "Was it always busy?" he asked one night, his voice barely a murmur over the bubbling of a tomato sauce. Elena's hand stilled. She thought of the warm, noisy chaos of her restaurant, the clatter of plates, the laughter, her father shouting orders, with a smile. The memory was so vivid it hurt. "On weekends you couldn't get a table," she said softly. "Families came, the same ones week after week. They became our family." She looked over at him, expecting to see a flicker of contempt, a sign that he found such sentimentality weak. Instead, she saw only that deep, unnerving stillness, his eyes holding a shadow she couldn't quite decipher. Her phone calls with Leo became more difficult. Her brother's voice was always tight with anxiety. He would ask if she was okay, if Damien had hurt her. "I'm fine, Leo," she would lie, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city lights far below. "I'm just cooking." How could she explain the shift? How could she describe the man who had destroyed their lives, now standing silently in the kitchen, watching her make risotto? How could she explain that his quiet presence was, in some strange way, less lonely than the silence that came after he left? The photograph of the boy haunted her. She saw his eyes in Damien's face during their silent dinners. She saw the ghost of that sadness when he thought she wasn't looking. She started cooking for that boy. She made simple, comforting things: a creamy polenta with mushrooms, a hearty chicken soup with fat, clumsy noodles, food that felt like a warm blanket. She was no longer just fulfilling a contract. She was trying to feed a hunger that had nothing to do with an empty stomach. She was speaking the only language she knew to a man who seemed to have forgotten how to speak his own. One evening, she made a simple roasted chicken stuffed with lemon and herbs. The entire penthouse, usually so sterile, smelled of home. It smelled of Sunday afternoons and family. Damien was unusually quiet during the meal, his gaze distant. Elena found herself breaking their unspoken rule. "Do you ever have guests for dinner?" she asked, her voice small in the vast dining room. He slowly set down his fork, the silver making a soft click against the porcelain plate. He looked out the window at the endless expanse of the city below. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he spoke, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. "I eat every meal alone." The words hung in the air between them. "I eat every meal alone." It was not a complaint. It was a fact, as solid and as cold as the marble floor beneath their feet. In that instant, Elena's perception of him shattered and reformed. He wasn't a king in his castle. He was a prisoner. The penthouse wasn't his fortress of power. It was his cage. A beautifully furnished, breathtakingly empty cage. The man who had everything, who could buy and break people at will, was profoundly, terrifyingly alone. A wave of something she refused to name washed over her. It was not pity. It was a startling, painful empathy. She too was alone in this place. They were two solitary souls, trapped together in a skyscraper that touched the clouds. After that night, the last remnants of hostility evaporated, replaced by a fragile, unspoken truce. A cautious curiosity bloomed in the silence. There were moments that felt charged with a strange electricity. Once, as she handed him a plate, their fingers brushed. The contact was fleeting, lighter than air, but it sent a jolt through her arm. He pulled his hand back as if he'd been burned, and a faint flush rose on his neck. They didn't speak of it. They didn't have to. It was the first time in weeks she had felt a human touch that wasn't her own. She found herself watching him, too. She watched the way his shoulders were always tense, even when he was sitting. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes that no amount of expensive tailoring could hide. The monster was still there. She knew he was. The man who had put her father in a hospital bed had not vanished. But now she saw the man inside the monster, the sad boy from the photograph, all grown up and trapped inside a life of his own making. The anger was still there, a pilot light burning low inside her. But it was no longer the only thing she felt. She continued to cook from her heart, but she held one thing back: her grandmother's lasagna. The recipe was the soul of Rossi's trattoria, a secret passed down on a faded, sauce-stained card. It was more than just food. It was their history, their love, their survival, all baked into layers of pasta and cheese. She couldn't give that to him. It felt like the final surrender, the one piece of her family's legacy she had to protect. One evening, nearly 3 weeks into her 30-day sentence, the air was calm. Dinner was over. She had made a simple pasta with fresh pesto, and he had eaten every bite. She was clearing the table, the scent of basil and garlic still lingering. Damien hadn't retreated to his office. He remained at the table, nursing a glass of water, watching her move back and forth from the kitchen. The city lights below were a glittering carpet, a silent, distant audience to their quiet drama. He let the silence stretch until it was comfortable, familiar. Then he spoke. His voice was different. It was softer, stripped of its usual command. For the first time, he used her name, and it sounded less like an order and more like a plea. Elena. She stopped, her hands full of plates, and turned to face him. His gray eyes were fixed on her, and for the first time they held no coldness. They held only a deep, profound weariness, and something else, a flicker of hope. "There is one dish," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "I know you've been holding it back. The one from your family's restaurant. The one that carries your grandmother's name." He paused, and his gaze was so intense it felt like a physical touch. "Cook me Nona's lasagna." The silence after his request was heavier than any argument they ever had. He wanted her to serve him her family's soul on a plate. Elena looked at him, searching those gray eyes for a trick. She found only a strange, hollow exhaustion. He had asked for Nona's lasagna. She gave a single, slow nod. The deal was the deal. The next morning, the penthouse felt different. Elena laid out her ingredients on the cold, stainless steel island. For the first time, she was not cooking to challenge him. She was cooking for her grandmother. She started the ragu, the heart of the dish. The sharp, sweet smell of onions, carrots, and celery was the first crack in the penthouse's sterile armor. It was the scent of 1,000 family dinners. For hours, the sauce simmered, a deep, bubbling red. The aroma filled every corner, a warm, living presence in a place that had felt like a tomb. It was a gentle, delicious conquest. Next came the pasta. She worked the flour and eggs on a wooden board she'd brought from home. Her hands, strong from years of kneading, pushed and folded. This was a feeling Damien's money could not buy. It was the memory of her Nana's hands, dusted with flour, guiding her own. With each pass of the rolling pin, she felt less like a prisoner. As she worked, she caught a glimpse of him in a reflection, standing in the doorway of his study. He was a shadow drawn to a fire. By late afternoon, she was ready to assemble. Each layer was a memory, a sheet of silken pasta, a ladle of rich, slow-cooked ragu, a creamy blanket of bechamel, a heavy shower of Parmesan cheese. It was an architecture of love, built layer by layer. An hour later, she pulled the lasagna from the oven. The top was a beautiful, bubbling mosaic of golden brown cheese. The scent made her own heart ache with longing. She served him at the long, dark dining table. She placed the plate before him without a word. For a moment, he just stared at it. He picked up his fork, his movements unusually hesitant. He cut a small piece, making sure to get every layer. He lifted it to his mouth, and the entire world seemed to hold its breath. He chewed slowly, his eyes closing. The fork in his hand lowered until it rested on the edge of the plate. A single crystalline tear escaped from the corner of his eye and traced a silent path down his cheek. Then another. His perfect, impenetrable control did not crack. It dissolved. He put his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with quiet, ragged sobs. Elena stood frozen. This was not the reaction she had expected. It was grief, raw, unguarded, and absolute. The sound of his weeping was the only noise in the vast, silent room. He was just a man, weeping over a plate of lasagna. After several long minutes, he finally looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed and hollowed by a sorrow so deep it seemed ancient. His voice, when he spoke, was unrecognizable. "My mother, Tara," he whispered, the words barely audible. "She used to make this." Elena remained silent. "Her name was Isabella," he continued, his gaze lost in the past. "She was a cook. She had a small place, a little bistro, nothing fancy." He took a shaky breath, his eyes finding Elena's. "It was on the same plot of land, the exact same spot where your father's restaurant stands now." Everything clicked into place. The obsession, the relentless, cruel pursuit of that specific building. It was never about business. "I was 8 years old," Damien said, his voice cracking. "I spent every day after school in that kitchen. The smell of her tomato sauce, it was the smell of my entire world. It smelled just like this." He stared at the lasagna as if seeing a ghost. There was a fire, a faulty gas line. It happened late one night. She had gone back to get something she forgot. His voice broke completely. "I was staying with a neighbor. The building was just gone, and she was gone with it. The story poured out of him, a torrent of pain held back for nearly 30 years. I wanted to tear it down. I wanted to erase the spot from the earth. I thought if the building was gone, the memory would finally go away. So I went after your father. I was a monster. I knew it, but I couldn't stop. The monster was gone. In his place sat a grieving boy trapped in a man's body. Elena's anger, the fury that had sustained her for weeks, simply evaporated. It was replaced by a wave of profound, aching empathy. She saw the sad-eyed boy from the photograph, the one who lost his mother. The space between them at the enormous table felt like a canyon of shared grief. He was still looking at her, expecting hatred. But Elena's hand moved on its own. Slowly, she reached across the space and gently placed her hand over his. His hand was cold, but he did not pull away. He just stared at their hands, his fingers trembling slightly beneath hers. For the first time, in the heart of his cold, empty kingdom, Damian Blackwood was not alone. The morning after his confession, the silence at the breakfast table was different. It was no longer hostile, but thick with shared grief and a strange intimacy. Damian sat across from her, the usual coldness in his eyes replaced by a profound exhaustion. He looked as if he had not slept, but simply stared into the darkness all night. This was the 30th day, the final day. The thought echoed in Elena's mind with every beat of her heart. A month ago, she would have been vibrating with a desperate need to escape. Now, the feeling was a tangled knot of relief and an unwelcome sadness. Damian slid a sleek black folder across the polished table. The sound was soft, but it landed like a gavel. "The terms of our agreement have been met," he said, his voice low. Elena's hands felt numb as she reached for it. Inside, the documents were crisp and life-changing. There was the deed to Rossi's Trattoria, her family's name in bold letters. Beneath it, bank statements were stamped with a final beautiful word: canceled. The mountain of debt was simply gone. She ran a finger over her father's name. Marco Rossi, she had done it. Yet the victory felt hollow. She looked up at Damian, the man who had caused this pain, and then erased it. "Thank you," she whispered. He gave a slight nod. "A deal is a deal. Your father's hospital expenses have also been settled. Anonymously, he will be released within the week." Elena's breath caught in her throat. He had taken care of it without her even having to ask. He let the silence settle, watching her face. "However," he said, and her heart gave a painful flutter, "I would like to propose a new arrangement. I want you to stay, not as a part of our previous agreement, but as my permanent chef." He named a salary that made her head spin, more than her restaurant made in a year. "You would have a complete creative freedom. The only condition is that you cook here. For me." The offer was staggering. It was a golden cage, but with an open door. She saw the plea behind his formal words. He was a lonely man in a vast, empty home. For a few short weeks, she had filled it with the scent of garlic and basil, with life. A foolish, compassionate part of her wanted to say yes. It wanted to see if the cracks in his armor could ever truly heal. But she looked down at the deed in her hands. Rossi's Trattoria. It was not just a building. It was her grandmother's laughter, her father's sweat-dusted hands. It was the place she had chopped her first onion. It was her past and her future. It was home. She slowly closed the folder and met his eyes. "Damian," she said, the name feeling natural for the first time. "It's an incredible offer, and I am grateful, but I cannot accept." A flicker of disappointment, or perhaps resignation, crossed his eyes before the mask returned. "I understand," he said quietly. "My place is at the restaurant," she explained, needing him to understand. "It is my family. It is who I am. I am a chef, but I am a Rossi first." She went to the guest room and packed the same small bag she had arrived with. Her clothes smelled faintly of his expensive cologne, an invisible trace of this place she would carry with her. Lastly, she went to the kitchen and unrolled the worn leather pouch containing her father's knives. The familiar wooden handles felt like an extension of her own hand. She was securing her legacy, her identity. When she was ready, she found him standing by the vast floor-to-ceiling windows. "I am leaving now," she said softly. He turned, his face unreadable. For a long moment, they just looked at each other from across the room. An entire story passed between them in that silence. The rage in his office, the defiant meals, the shattering confession over a plate of lasagna. It had all started as a cruel transaction, but had become something real and fragile. Elena, he said, his voice raw. He took a step toward her, then stopped, as if held back by an invisible wall. She could see the words he wanted to say in the clenching of his jaw, but he had no right to speak them. "Goodbye, Damien," she said, her own voice thick with unshed tears. She could not hate him. All she felt was a profound, aching pity. She turned and walked to the counter, placing her keycard on the smooth, cold stone. She did not look back. She walked toward the front door, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. Each step was a step toward her family, toward the comforting chaos of her own kitchen. Each step was a step away from him. She pressed the button for the elevator, her heart hammering against her ribs. As the door slid open, she risked one last glance over her shoulder. He was still standing by the window, a solitary figure framed against the endless sky. He had not moved. He was just watching her go. The elevator doors slid shut. As it descended, the city rose up to meet her. She was free. Her family was safe. She had won. But as she walked out of the opulent building and the cool city air hit her face, her relief was tangled with an unbearable sorrow. Her heart ached with a confusing mix of liberation and loss. 3 months had passed. Elena no longer counted the days. Her life now followed the rhythm of Rossi's trattoria, its air thick with garlic and fresh basil. The money from Damien had restored the restaurant, but it had not changed its soul. Faded family photographs still lined the walls. Her father, Marco, greeted guests from a chair near the door, his spirit healing alongside his leg. Her brother Leo moved between tables with a new, easy confidence, his smile charming everyone. Elena felt it too, a sense of belonging in the heat of her own kitchen. She was in command, her family was safe, and their legacy was secure. She had won. But sometimes in the quiet after closing, she would stare at the city skyline. She would see the Blackwood Tower, a dark shard of glass piercing the clouds. She remembered the silence of the penthouse. She remembered the cold gray eyes that had impossibly learned to show warmth. She never spoke of Damien. The 30 days were a secret she kept, a confusing ache that had led to this beautiful peace. "Elena, table 4 is raving about the carbonara," Leo said, bursting through the kitchen doors. He told her it was the best they had ever had. Elena smiled, a genuine, untroubled smile. "Tell them Nana's ghost is my sous chef tonight." As Leo left, she turned her attention to a pan of sizzling scallops. She was searing the last one when she felt it. A subtle shift in the restaurant's energy. Conversations near the door had faltered. She glanced through the service window. Her brother Leo was frozen mid-step, his eyes wide, staring at the entrance. Her father had slowly pushed himself up from his chair, his hand gripping his cane. Then she saw him. Damien Blackwood stood just inside the doorway. He was not the man she knew. The impeccably tailored suit was gone, replaced by a simple gray sweater and dark jeans. The armor was gone. He looked younger, almost hesitant, and he was alone. His stormy gray eyes scanned the room, not with an air of ownership, but with a quiet, searching quality. For a moment, the world tilted. The sizzling of the scallops faded to a distant hiss. All Elena could see was him, standing in the warm light of her family's restaurant. The man who had almost destroyed them. The man who had, in the end, saved them. Her heart gave a single hard thud against her ribs. He was not supposed to be here. He belonged to a world of cold glass, not warm wood and roasting rosemary. Leo took a protective step toward the kitchen, but Elena held up a hand, a silent command. She wiped her hands on her apron, her movements slow and deliberate. She took a deep breath, then pushed through the swinging kitchen doors. The space between them felt like a mile. A few diners turned to look, sensing the sudden tension. Damien's gaze finally found hers. There was no arrogance in his expression. There was just a man, standing in a room full of people, looking completely alone. She stopped a few feet away. She did not know what to say. He was the first to speak, his voice quiet, stripped of its usual authority. "Hello, Elena." Her name on his lips still did something strange to her. It was the voice that had given her impossible orders, but also the voice that had confessed its deepest pain. "Damien," she replied, her own voice steady. He gestured slightly to the room. "It's Warm, he said, as if the concept were foreign. It's just like I remember. The confession hung in the air, not his memory, but his mother's. He had come to see a ghost of the bistro that once stood here. A young waitress, new and unaware, approached him with a menu. Table for one? She asked brightly. Damien looked at Elena, a question in his eyes. He was asking her permission. He was a guest in her world now, and he knew it. The power had shifted completely. He held no contracts, only a shared, painful history. Elena felt the knot of tension in her chest finally unwind. The anger was a distant echo. She gave a small nod to the waitress. Then she looked back at him. He was led to a small table in the corner. He sat down, looking oddly out of place, and yet somehow exactly where he needed to be. He did not open the menu. He just sat there, watching the life of the restaurant swirl around him. Elena retreated to the threshold of her kitchen. From there, she could see her partner, who had slowly sat back down, his expression unreadable. She saw Leo, and she gave him a reassuring glance. And she saw Damien, a solitary figure in a sea of warmth. Their eyes met one last time across the bustling room. He offered a small, hesitant smile. It was a fragile thing, full of apology and hope. It was not a smirk, it was a request. After a long moment, Elena felt the corners of her own mouth lift in response. She returned his smile with a slow nod of acknowledgement, a truce, an acceptance. She turned back to her kitchen, the sizzle of the pan calling her home.